I have roll call.
Chairperson Messersmith,
Here,
Commissioner Huntoon, Commissioner Blair, Commissioner Dunton, Commissioner DeNublio,
here.
Commissioner Seegers,
Here.
and Commissioner Turtley.
Here.
We have a quorum.
Thank you. We'll have the Pledge of Allegiance, or I guess we can. So if you'll please join me with a pledge. I pledge allegiance
To the flag.
to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, and indivisible, with justice for all. I think I blew it there. Consideration of public comments. We shouldn't have any public, should we?
We did not receive any comments before the meeting, sir.
Thank you. I guess we need to swing right in there to old business, zoning ordinance update, please.
Good evening, everybody. My name is Carl Eberhard. I'm an architect. I live in Flagstaff, Arizona for about another 12 days, and then I'll be living in Washington. I work with Lisa Weiss Consulting, and I have been working with them and with city staff on some of the goals for historic preservation. So the presentation that I have for you tonight is really 4 parts. The first 3 are the presentation that I made to the City Council in June. And then the 4th part is kind of an update on where we're at and some of the decisions that are currently being made that you may want to weigh in on. I'm going to move fairly fast through the first 3 parts. It's pretty much of an introduction to historic preservation and maybe old hat to you folks. I encourage you to jump in if I'm moving too quickly, or if you have a question, I'd invite you just to jump in. And with that, I will share my screen and we can get started. Does that sound good to everybody? Perfect. I gotta figure out how to do this now. Can you see my screen? No.
We cannot. If you just click the little green share screen arrow at the bottom, there you go.
Okay, now do you see City of Kingman Historic Preservation on it?
Yes.
Perfect, all right. So as I said, this is the presentation that I gave to the council in June. And in June, it was 3 parts. I basically did an introduction to historic preservation, some discussion about historic overlay districts, and then some discussion about the additional historic preservation tools that Kingman might want to consider. So when we start with the introduction to historic preservation, you know, people think oftentimes that historic preservation is just about buildings, but actually it can be districts or sites or structures or objects. You know, you might notice you've got your train here or the tanks, things that you may not typically think of as historic resources, but in fact they are. They should be things that are significant in the history and architecture or archaeology of Kingman. And importantly, these are things that Kingman decides, whether it's a recommendation from your commission to the council. This is not something that the feds or the state or anybody puts upon you. These are things that you decide are important to the city of Kingman. You know, some of the reasons for pursuing historic preservation, you know, for cities, these are a great way to protect your city. They're a great community investment. There's better paying jobs with it. Tourism's better and so forth. And then for property owners, historic preservation can bring a number of tax credits and grant opportunities. And typically historic districts are more stable in rough economic times. Here in Flagstaff during the recession of '08, our historic district value only went down by 4%, where the rest of the city went down by closer to 25%. So that's the kind of things that historic preservations can do for both cities and property owners. You know, some of the things that people worry about with historic preservation, and you folks probably very familiar with this. You know, a lot of people think this is just a way to, you know, kind of put grandma's oil lamp and a doily in the window and nothing changes and everything stops forever. And that's really not the case. There's 4 treatments for historic properties. You know, the preservation is to maintain it as it is. Restoration is to put it back. And reconstruction is rebuilding the missing, which is not one of the most favorite ideas. But the one that's really important from a redevelopment perspective is the idea of rehabilitation, where an older building gets a new use. And I know in Kingman, you're very familiar with this, where, you know, gas stations are maybe turned into a restaurant, oftentimes houses turn into other businesses. It's a very powerful tool for keeping old properties around and functioning for more time. You know, the other big myth that a lot of people run into is that, well, you know, the National Register kind of takes care of this and we don't really need to do anything. And that's really not the case. The National Register listing really only protects projects that have federal funds, license, or permits associated with them. They don't actually protect things from local risk sources, whether it's a highway project or a developer, whatever it might be. In order to protect properties locally, you have to take action locally. And you may know this from creating your district. So just to sum it up, you know, this is the points that I wanted to kind of get people to understand the basics of historic preservation. The next thing is looking at historic districts. So historic districts basically have 3 parts. You know, your survey of the district, which is oftentimes an inventory, a boundary for the district, and then a set of guidelines. And your district has all of those associated with it. And we were asked to look at some of the expansion opportunities for your district, which we've done, and I'll deal with that a little bit later in the presentation. But you can see your existing district is just this one little 3-block long, and I guess this little wing out here stretch. One of the things that's important to note about historic preservation in Flagstaff, in Arizona, is that in Arizona, historic preservation is a function of zoning. So some of the things that come into play is that it is actually a zoning change on people's property. So you really want to think about the older Proposition 207, not the one we just passed. It's really important that the property owners have buy-in. And one of the things that you will have to decide as a city is, do you want to allow property owners to opt out of the district in order to avoid a Proposition 207 claim, in which case you end up with Swiss cheese districts, or do you take the hit and potential ramifications of forcing a zoning change on somebody who maybe doesn't want it? The other thing that's really important about historic overlay districts is that there needs to be a champion locally. You know, it's great that I come along and make some suggestions and recommendations and so forth. Or even if, you know, staff makes some suggestions and recommendations and so on. But the truth of the matter is there needs to be a local champion, somebody whom the community looks up to, trusts, who will take up the torch and bring it forward. Without that, it's very difficult to get these approved, particularly approved in a way that would be legally safe for the city to avoid litigation. So again, you know, even just expanding them, you still have the same 3 components as we talked about. I'll talk a little bit more about what's in the opportunities we've identified. And then these are some of the things you kind of want to think about when you want to expand your district. The last thing that we talked about with the council was just some other ways that the council could support historic preservation in the Kingman area. Many communities have a local grant program where the city does some matching funds, or there's a lot of different tools. And so that a building might get some of its historic features put back on the building because the city's willing to contribute. when I was staff for the city, this was a fabulous tool because somebody might come in and want to put vinyl windows in, and I could literally bribe them and say, well, if you put in wood windows and I pay for the difference, would that work for you? And most oftentimes they would go for it. One of the other tools that we talked about was a landmarks overlay district. And this is something that Roger Eastman, who's our project chairman, and I cooked up in Flagstaff, and it's been a very successful tool. And basically what we did is we created an empty district that has all the guidelines and boundaries and everything built in, ready to go. And then property owners can one at a time ask to be put in that district. In Flagstaff, we've put about 70 acres worth of historic properties into the landmarks district. And that sounds like a big number, but the truth of the matter is one of the properties was 62 acres. So that's not totally fair. But we do get a number of people that, they want to preserve the property in perpetuity. And this is a tool that can help them do that. There's a few things they need to do also, but it's something that Kingman could have ready and waiting to go if there was somebody interested in preserving their property. It also avoids 207 claims since it's voluntary. One of the other tools that we talked about with council was the concept of cultural resource studies. And you'll see on the left side of my screen, the cultural resource studies really answer 4 questions. Are there resources? Are they significant? Will they be harmed by whatever's being proposed? And could that harm be mitigated? So these are often used or typically used in association with a development application. Somebody wants to come in and work on such a property. The point is to actually kind of think about whether that property is historic and should it be preserved and those kinds of questions. And a lot of times owners just straight don't know. So this is a tool for the owner and for the decision-making bodies, that whether it's the building department or the planning and zoning commission or whomever it might be, so that if something turns out to be historic, the decision to develop the property or redevelop the property is done with intent and knowledge of exactly what it is that you're working with. And this is an example of what I'm talking about. I don't know if y'all are familiar that much with Flagstaff, but this property here is the El Pueblo Motel, which has been a single room occupancy, basically a flop house since 1968. I assure you, you'd rather sleep in your car than sleep in this hotel. But it turns out that this hotel was the first hotel built out of the downtown area, and it was built by a gentleman named Philip Johnston, who thought up the idea of code talkers in World War II. And most of the code talkers were recruited out of this hotel. So not only is it significant in Flagstaff history because of its development patterns and architecture and those things that you might typically think about historic structures, but it's also significant in world history because the whole code talker concept was built around this by this gentleman. So you just don't know when you look at something like this that looks beat up and nasty, what it really is in the background. And in this case, the property owner ended up not demolishing the building, which was his original plan, and is now implementing this plan over here, which is a full restoration of the property to a fabulous condition that everybody's excited about. So again, in summary, I want to add one. The other thing about cultural resource studies, we often focus on the built resources, and this is oftentimes an opportunity to look for archaeological resources too. Sometimes out in the woods or wherever you find things that you weren't expecting that are out there, and if you don't look for them, you'll never know they're there and nothing will be done to preserve them. So again, some of the other ideas that we presented, the grants program, the overlay, and the cultural resource studies. So moving on to update you folks, following that, we received direction that what was desired for us in advancing the effort was a 3-part thing. Expand the historic district, add a landmarks overlay district to the zoning code, and then add cultural resource studies, but limited only to within the historic districts, which is a pretty good solution, and I might talk about that a little bit later. So when we look at those actions that were asked of us, Adding the landmarks district and adding the cultural resource studies is pretty much a text addition to the zoning code. So there's maybe some discussion with the public and maybe some discussion with you folks about the particulars of what we do and how we do it. But it's pretty straightforward stuff for the most part. So really the expanding the historic district is the little bit trickier part that we've been working on for the last few months. So the first thing that we have in our scope of work was to review the potential for expansion of the district. So we took a look at the inventory, the boundary, and the guidelines that Kingman has in place right now. And what you'll see is that you do have the documents in place. They're vintage 1984, which is unfortunate. And the survey that was done was a windshield survey, which is fine by modern standards. There's actually a slightly better step. Actually, in 1984, I'm surprised they didn't do a more thorough inventory, but that's okay. You have a context that was written to 1984, which means it only covers buildings to 1934. So it's a little bit out of date. But the truth of the matter is when you look at the boundary of the district, it was probably set up based on supportive property owners more than a context setting. And then you do have guidelines, but we'll look at those a little bit later after we get into the boundary. The boundary is really what we've been focusing our energy on, is how do we want to compose this district. We've also done some on-the-ground survey work in Kingman. And again, kind of thinking about the boundary, when you look at the area south of the railroad tracks on the other side of Andy Devine, there's some interesting resources back in there. It's not as contiguous as you might like for a district. And probably your south side has a little bit different context than your north side. Most cities do. So we recommended that we let the Landmarks District Code kind of deal with the south side, and that we kind of consider the current southern boundary of Andy Devine as a pretty good boundary. Your district is also bound to the west by First Street. And again, that's a pretty good boundary. The high school, I think it is on the west side of the road. And then the historic part of downtown's on the east side. So that makes a pretty good boundary. Looking at the north end for potential expansion, the most logical, first point you run into is Spring Street, which is the one with the courthouse. And that's pretty much the boundary of the commercial district. When you get north of that, it's pretty residential. I'll put a little asterisk, if we updated your context study, it might suggest a more northern boundary. But we've got, kind of those two options to look at. And then looking at the east side, it becomes even more interesting. You could stop at 5th, 6th, or at some point further east. Just initially looking at the ground survey that we did, 5th or 6th Street is probably the right choice in our minds. And again, an updated context study could suggest a different boundary. One of the other things that becomes obvious in Kingman, like it was here in Flagstaff, is that, sorry?
Could I ask a question at this point?
Absolutely.
Once the boundary is established, what tool can someone outside the boundary who has a significant piece of property use to be within the overlay?
So right now you do not have a tool for that purpose. We are recommending that you create the Landmarks Overlay District, which would allow any property in the city citywide to become part of the Landmarks District.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome. And I really encourage you, just stop me, yell at me, throw things at me, whatever you need to do.
Carl?
Yes.
I'd just like to make a comment about that. The cultural resources that we have extend way beyond some of the boundaries. We've got Beale Springs and the wagon tracks up on White Cliffs. Those types of resources could also be included that way too, so you guys can understand that. We'd like to keep those protected, and just because they're not in the district doesn't mean they're not really important and significant to our area.
That's correct. And for that exact same purpose, when Flagstaff introduced the cultural resource studies, they made those required citywide so that they could understand resources from boundary to boundary of the city itself. And that was for the express purpose of picking up those hidden gems that people may not otherwise notice. You know, many people have said a wagon tracks isn't noticed.
Right. Right. There are areas all over town, even up on Hilltop, that could fall into that category, and those individuals could very well want to be included in the protection or to be able to use the tools. They're just not, they're just not geographically close to what the district is. So I just wanted to make that clear to our members.
And, Kingman, like Flagstaff, has a Route 66 route through the city. It's obviously influences your downtown area and did influences historic development, but obviously it's geographically substantially larger than your downtown. So, again, you probably don't want to make your downtown district be the Route 66 district. You could also leave protection of Route 66 resources under the landmarks overlay tool. But, something y'all might want to think about in the future is creating a Route 66 district that could pick up the hotels and the restaurants and the gas stations and have a context and a guidelines that are appropriate for Route 66 district, as opposed to a downtown that has an older history that happens to include Route 66.
And that's a great idea. I like that, because that would follow Route 66 on the south side as it winds through the canyon, and I like that. That's a great idea. Thank you.
So where we're kind of at with the project overall right now is we've had some really interesting discussions about the boundary. And there's some basic tools that communities use to establish boundaries of historic districts. Sometimes they're just simply chosen by the city, whether it's by staff or a commission like yourselves, or maybe a consultant like myself. Sometimes you have property owners that reach out and really want to get it preserved. Our town site district here in Flagstaff was completely driven by the neighborhood. It's, champions necessary. And then another way to approach it is sort of a context-based approach, where you kind of let the history of the area tell you where the boundary wants to be. Based on your 34-year-old context study, you would probably need to update that before you could use that as a good basis. And then it could be any combination of these things up above. So a couple of things that we recommend is that the expansion of the district really needs to be supported by the property owners involved. It's been our experience that without property owner involvement and participation, in particular a champion, you get challenged, particularly with 207. It's just not a way to get it done in a successful way. And I would bet your original district at half a block by 3 blocks long was probably because the property owners were willing to do it. And we really need a champion. That champion could be you, the commission. It could be property owners down there. There's a lot of ways to do it. But in our humble opinion, it shouldn't be us, and it probably shouldn't be the city. The second thing we ran into, as I mentioned, was with regard to your 34-year-old context document. And we put forth the idea that, it would probably be a good idea to update your context materials. And this is basically your multi-property resource documentation that was done in '84, and expanding that so there's more historic themes. And the easiest one for y'all to understand what I'm saying is, for example, it ends in 1934. So it doesn't have any Route 66 material in it at all. And between 1934 and the end of Route 66, there are a couple other themes that are possibly within that area. The drawback we're running into is that's outside of the scope of work of what we're doing. I did work with the city staff and contacted SHPO, and there's a potential for a grant from SHPO to pay for some or all of that. that of course brings about delay. That means that rather than doing this in 3 months from now, we have to work our way through the state processes and get a grant, and then, get all that work accomplished. So if we wanted to look at moving forward without doing an update of your multi-property documentation context document, based on our ground survey and so forth, we think that going from 1st to 5th and going from Andy Devine to the middle of the block or whatever the property is fronting Spring Street, that's a pretty reasonable expansion that you could do. Your context study that you have would pretty much support that. You could even extend it over to 6th. It gets a little sketchy up in here. It fits a little bit better down in here. But this is kind of what we're looking at, is where do we want this boundary to be? And again, without public input and without a champion, it gets even harder for you and even harder for us to figure out what the right answer is. For example, I'm not picking on anybody. I don't know who owns this property. But let's say that this person here is vehemently opposed to historic preservation district. Well, you can take the district and jog around him, for example, right? Or conversely, if this person over here is very much interested in being in it, you can make the district go around them and grab them in. So that's a big part of what needs to be happening still is get a champion and get public buy-in, and that will help us adjust the final boundary from this initial suggestion that we might make.
Right. I would, just based on what I'm looking at, I would jump up and grab Palo Cristi School.
Okay.
Did you guys look at that?
We probably did without knowing it by name or location, but we took a good look around the area. And so this is exactly where your input and the community input will help us, because you know what's important and what's not.
Right.
But again, right now we're somewhat shooting in the dark with no public input going on.
Carl, a little off topic, the kind of back to somebody sponsoring it. Will this presentation, or has this presentation been made to the, I forgot what they're called. It's not the Downtown Merchant Association.
The Main Street folks?
Again?
Probably Main Street?
Yeah.
Not yet. We're ready to do that. Once we kind of settle on an initial boundary discussion, we're definitely ready to have that conversation.
Okay, good, because we're a dynamic group of people.
Yeah, and if they look at any downtown in America, historic overlay is a good thing, and hopefully they'll see that and be supportive of the effort.
Oh, I don't doubt that they would not jump on this.
Oftentimes Main Streets are the catalyst for making historic districts happen, to be honest with you. So,
say again?
I said, oftentimes Main Street foundations are the catalyst for making these districts, getting them created.
I apologize for the request for repeats. I'm on my phone, and it's a terrible speaker.
My apologies that we're not coming through clear. Y'all are pretty faint for me too, so I'm challenged at the same time.
All right.
So, again, once we kind of have an idea of where Kingman would like to focus their energies, whether it's here or if they want to go do a context study that is more cost and delay, whichever way they want to go, we're ready to move forward with the district, which is going to be that outreach that you were just asking about. And we'll begin to do a little bit more detailed surveying of the buildings there, identifying the contributing buildings and the features that we want to do, and then we can move on to doing your guidelines. But right at the moment, figuring this out is where we are. And so that's really the update for your commission. That's what we presented to council to kind of bring them up to speed. And it's a catch up for you as to where we are today. And I'd be delighted to answer any questions, take any suggestions, comments, thoughts, etc.
Carl,
I've bothered you enough. However, I'd like to make a motion that the slides be appended to the minutes of this meeting.
I'd be glad to do that.
they will be. We don't need a motion for that.
Okay.
One thing, Carl, I really appreciate what you're doing. And the point that you're at now with identifying the boundaries, boy, has always been the challenge. So when you spend more time doing that, well, I'd really like our commissioners to get involved. Maybe even when you decide on which meeting you present to the Kingman Main Street group. I know we can't meet as a group there. We don't want to create a quorum, but a couple of our commissioners definitely attend that meeting as well, as support to you when you make that presentation to the Main Street group.
Yeah. That's actually really critically important. I mean, it would be entirely possible for your commission to be the champions of this effort. Obviously better if Main Street was a partner with you in doing that. But we kind of need to get some of that local flavor feeling from you and from them about boundaries. You know, somebody mentioned about the school, you know, things like that, so that, you know, like I said, if we just kind of hit everything possible, it becomes an unmanageable project and it won't come off. So we kind of got to look at a balance between what are the important areas that want to be preserved and why, balanced with what are the politics of who in those areas would be on board and who's going to fight us. And so, and I, as a consultant from out of town, even if I was there, I doubt I'd be tapped into it. But we need the folks like you that are tapped into the community to help us figure out where will we be successful and where are we wasting our time.
Right.
And when I say we, I mean Kingman more than myself.
Right. And the more support that we can not only give you, but in essence, like, you know, really stand behind it and become the champion.
And if I'm the champion, it's a fail. I'm just going to be honest with you. Right.
And I think politically, and this is strictly my opinion based on years of seeing this, I think the Main Street group would really step up, and I'm not speaking for them, but I'd really like to see them step up and be the champion with our commission as, you know, the right-hand man for that group. I just think between Main Street and this commission, that would be our champion for this.
I might suggest an intermediate step. I agree with you 100%. I think that's a fabulous strategy. I don't know if you all have any contact within the Main Street Foundation, but again, I think the Main Street Foundation was approached by the local Historic Preservation Commission, as opposed to by me, Joe Consultant from out of town, and had some of those conversations ahead of time and said, hey, we've got this thing brewing. We really want to get you involved. Let's rope in Eberhard. He'll give you this presentation. And that way, they understand that this is coming from the people of Kingman and not from consultants.
Right. And we can bring in other organizations as well. You know, the Arizona Preservation Foundation and those folks down there are so awesome supporting us as it is. We bring them in as well. I think that's a great strategy.
And I've already talked to SHPO because of the grant, and they're very excited about what we're up to. They're on board already. Like they're ready to give us 20 grand basically.
Right.
Isn't our little Main Street chapter, or whatever you call it, not understanding the nuances of how they're built up, they're affiliated with the National Main Street organization, aren't they?
I believe they are, yes. I think the way they were established, I believe they are. I can confirm that.
I thought they did a great.
Yes, Paul.
Once again, my speaker is horrible. I didn't hear what was said.
I was saying I could reach out to Main Street. I work in the same building as Gina, who is the AmeriCorps volunteer, kind of heading up Main Street right now.
Oh, great, yeah. I had been going to their meetings until I decided to fly my Jeep. I'd like, I'll repeat it. I think they're a very dynamic organization. They did very well with the facade program with grants, and just a good organization.
They are currently working on developing a community accessible playground at the Palo Cristi campus right now. The playground would in essence be in the same location as the Palo Cristi playground, but they're real excited about it, and they've got a lot of great ideas to make that a real community asset. So you're right, Paul. They're pretty dynamic and they're energetic. So Nikki, you and I will work on them real well. Carl, thank you very much.
Thank you. And I would like to add, I will get the presentation to Annie in the next day or so she can get that out to you folks. I'd love to see you get it as a PDF or something. You can kind of dig through it. And I would encourage all of you to feel free to grab a red pen and start drawing on my boundary drawing, or make notes, or whatever you might think as the local historic experts that I should be thinking about and incorporating into your downtown district.
I've got a couple of tools that we can use at that meeting, some enlargements of downtown. We can dry erase mark on it, scratch notes, and whenever that meeting happens, Carl, you let us know and we'll be sure and be there.
Sounds good. I'll work with your city staff and maybe with Nikki to see if we can get that set up sooner rather than later.
Great, thank you.
I have a quick question. How informed or how is the oh, now I can't think of the name of the city Chamber of Commerce? How are they involved at all?
I'm not totally aware of that. I'd probably have to ask some of the city staff. I know that the zoning code itself has been under discussion in Kingman, the larger zoning code project, for some months now. I don't know if there's been any specific discussion about the historic preservation effort. We took a slight pause to pursue this context study grant idea. So we kind of put everything on hold while we went down that road for a little while. So we're kind of coming back to it now.
I'll make a call to the chamber and see. They may be interested. They would, we could reach out for their support. I don't know what their membership looks like, but we certainly should have that discussion because their office is located downtown. So
important partners.
And would be would be located in your proposed boundaries right now. So I'll be sure and reach out to them as well.
Thank you, Bill.
Annie, would it be possible for you to share my contact information with the commission? And would they be allowed to communicate with me some of their ideas and thoughts on an offline email basis?
Go ahead.
So as long as any communication did not include a quorum of the commissioners and it was just individual one-on-one communication with you, that would be fine.
Thank you.
Is there any other questions or comments?
Thank you all. I know this is sometimes a challenge, but I appreciate it.
So hearing no other comments coming up, we'll adjourn this meeting. And Bill, we still need to get together for that second cup of coffee someday.
I agree, Dan. I agree. I'll do my best.
Good. Thank you, folks.
Thank you.
We are adjourned.